A nomination of a brother who's been paying dues to our local union for 34 years. Started out as a steward at Hay & Company in Woodstock. Worked his way up to plant chairman, and in 1959 was elected president of our local union. In 1961, he was appointed to staff by Brother George Burt. In 1971, he became administrative assistant to Brother Dennis McDermott. And in 1978, he became director of UAW in Canada. It gives me great honor to nominate Brother Bob White to be president of our national union, UAW.
I declare that by your unanimous choice, you have chosen as your first president, your first national president, Brother Bob White.
In December 1981, the UAW Executive Board was summoned to Detroit and presented an astounding proposal, a resolution that would permit GM and Ford councils to reopen their collective agreements in order to negotiate concessions. The sole vote against reopening contracts was cast by Bob White.
He was making the case at that time that if we didn't open up our agreements in 82, early 82, that when we got to bargaining in September of 82, which was a normal time frame, the industry would be in worse shape, the corporations would come charge and we'd lose more. I never bought that argument. I said that if we did the job with the membership through all of 82 and fought against concessions, in the end of the day, we might have had to give up something, but we'd have given up much less than we did going in this way because the corporations knew they had us on the run. It was a very, very bad time, I thought, for our union. And, I mean, once again, we were on a completely different course in Canada.
On the heels of the Canadian success at GM, Doug Fraser settled for a fourth concessions agreement at Chrysler. But the leadership held off presenting this agreement to the membership for ratification. Local reps approved it by only 51%. Chrysler chairman Iacocca worked hand in hand with the union leadership to sell the agreement to the workers.
And we've got, between now and ratification of the process, got to go back and convince them that it's a good, fair, honest deal for a year, which it is. I hope they will respect it and keep their jobs.
Despite a hard sell by both the union and the company, when the union finally put the agreement to a vote, it was rejected in Chrysler plants across the U.S. The Canadian section was also in negotiations with Chrysler. Never before in the UAW's history had the two sections of the union been committed to such opposite approaches. The Canadians not only refused concessions, but demanded a significant upfront wage increase. But there was an external roadblock, the American leadership. Aware that Doug Fraser was pressuring the Canadians, Chrysler was counting on him to prevail.
I said, we've been sitting around this hotel for weeks, and obviously you're not serious. I know that you aren't making these decisions to be made in Detroit. But somebody's convinced that we're not in control here. That Doug Fraser or somebody's going to come across and stop this strike. And I want to tell you, it's going to start next Thursday morning, or Friday morning it was, at 10 o'clock in the morning. And you better get the message clear, unless we get some money here and start putting this thing together. We're going on strike, and nobody is going to stop us.
Chrysler was getting the message. Iacocca himself came to Toronto.
And he had a cigar going, and somebody gave me one before I went, so I lit one up too. I want to be even. And Iacocca, as he always does, pontificates about all of the problems around the world, and then we sat down, and he looked at me, and he said, so we have a problem with the committee and the membership here, eh? And I said, I never met you before in my life, Lee. We don't have any problem with the goddamn committee and the membership. You got a problem with me, and we're going to strike your corporation until you put some money in the package. I said, you ain't going to separate the leadership of this union from the membership.
10,000 striking Canadian workers shut down 6 Chrysler plants. In plant after plant, workers rallied in support of the firm Canadian position.
Chrysler is paying the banks, they're paying the suppliers, and it's goddamn near time they start paying the workers back.
Tom Miner, Chrysler's top negotiator, arrived in Toronto, and the union knew it was finally being taken seriously. Fraser also showed up to help the union, but just the same, he tried to get the Canadians to back down from their demands. But Chrysler was realizing that Fraser couldn't make the Canadians fall into line. Wanting an end to the strike, Chrysler paid up. The Canadian strategy was vindicated. The union won a wage increase, and it didn't bankrupt Chrysler. Canadian Chrysler workers reaped the benefits and were jubilant over the settlement.
I feel absolutely elated. I think there's a great feeling in the membership and leadership, and I'm just happy that the workers can get back to work before Christmas.
Doug Fraser worked out the long-postponed American settlement in Toronto, then flew to Detroit for the announcement.
I don't want to talk about any of the details of the agreement, but it'll be the same as Canada.
In 1983, the big three automakers began a rapid recovery. GM and Ford made $5.5 billion in profits. Iacocca visited Reagan to repay Chrysler's $1 billion loan 7 years early. The economic issues used by the American leadership to justify concessions had disappeared. In September 1984, the American UAW called for rotating strikes at U.S. GM plants, raising the hopes of American workers that they were finally going to get back what they had lost to concessions. 9 days later, Bieber announced a tentative agreement that provided for bonuses instead of a wage increase. The concessions mentality had become institutionalized.
Settlement does not fit the Canadian situation. Their settlement includes profit sharing, and we have a different philosophy about that.
And the monetary settlement, we have some differences on that. So
Canadian GM workers were clear on what they wanted, an increase in base pay and improvements in benefits.
and we moved towards a strike deadline, and then the interference started from Detroit again. And it was very clear that Owen Bieber in his discussions with me was really saying that they can't handle the situation of where the Canadians are always going to go a different direction than the Americans.
When GM tabled a clone of the American agreement, the Canadians had no choice but to strike. GM and the Canadian negotiating team continued to meet at the bargaining table, but it was becoming increasingly obvious that the negotiations were a facade behind which Owen Bieber was pulling the strings. Without the Canadians' permission, Bieber tried to sell a deal based on a variation of the American agreement. Bieber's maneuver had been leaked, and Bob White was waiting for Bieber to call. A National Film Board crew captured these moments as part of the film Final Offer. White realized the consequences of rejecting Bieber's deal.
So as you guys understand, we really are talking about the end of the International Union. Because Owen Bieber will go absolutely bananas.
When Bieber called, White turned down the deal, adding that the Canadians were prepared to break off negotiations and lock in the strike until GM met their demands.
When I lock that son of a bitch in, now I know Roger Smith is tough, and I know he's going to move some jobs, but I'm going to lock that son of a bitch in this weekend, and I told Andrew across the table, when I lock it in, it'll stay for 6 weeks without us even having a meeting. The GM can't win this. I'll wrap the fucking Canadian flag around me. These multinational corporation with Roger Smith and 146% increase, I've told them all of that. And when I get through, the membership will sit. Now, we'll pay a hell of a price for that. We will pay a hell of a price for that. But we are not going down the road, and I'd love to look Roger Smith in the eye, we're not going down the road for nickels and dimes. And as of 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, I will have Andrew at the bargaining table here and tell him these negotiations are finished.
Like the Chrysler strike in '82, GM finally got the message that the Canadians were not only in charge, but were completely committed to staying on strike until a good agreement was achieved. GM reconsidered and settled.
I think it is a fairly historic day. I think it does once again show that sometimes we have a little tussle about it, but GM is starting to recognize the Canadian realities. And I think this is an important achievement. It's not
that we are not going to go through this again. We can't keep going through this in our union where we have to be in conflict with our own leadership about collective bargaining objectives. That we have to accept that if we're going to have the Canadians have the right to have a collective bargaining conference and establish their priorities, then we have to accept the right of them to pursue those priorities. And those collective agreements and the settlements can't be based on whether or not the settlement is politically acceptable in the United States. I went to the Canadian and Quebec councils and talked about what I thought was necessary for autonomy within the International Union. And we had a debate in Detroit on that, and that was rejected by a vote of 24-1. And then following that, a motion was made by myself that we restructure the International UAW into two organizations, an American UAW and a Canadian UAW, and that vote was carried by 17-7. We're building our new organization with enormous confidence because we have no intention of letting this organization fail. It has, as you said this morning, we came from a family that has a long, long tradition of success in the fight for collective bargaining and economic and social justice. And I just want to say to you that the UAW Canada, which has been given birth in Toronto this week, will move onward and upward together with the rest of the Canadian labour movement. And thank you very much for coming here. Workers' rights didn't happen by accident. Workers joined together in trade unions and fought like hell to make change happen. And that's exactly what's the case of minorities and women in our society today. Women won't get on the executive boards of local unions or elected to the committees in the plants by accident or if you throw them in the general pool. You have to make some decisions that you're going to move them ahead on certain affirmative action programs. It has to be done in order that they can have an opportunity to play their rightful place within this union. I want to, if I can, take our minds back to a few years ago, as Brother Hanson said, when we had this type of discussion before, as plant after plant was closing. We had the Bendix situation in Windsor, we had several other plants, and I remember we had a CAW council meeting in Port Elgin. And I remember saying to that council before noon one day that I thought we might have to reach back in the history of our union and do something much more dramatic, because there's no good in picketing empty plants. And out of that came a decision that if we were going to have all of these plant closings, we had absolutely no legislation then at all. We made a decision that the next plants that were going to be closed, we were going to find a way to take over the plants from the inside and stop the employers from taking their equipment and everything out of the plants.
Let's be clear here. We've had a long bargaining relationship here, and when a company announces a closing, they have an obligation to sit down and talk to us the reason for the closing and sit down and negotiate a severance package. And we represent these people, and we're going to get into this plant one way or the other, just so as you know. And we're going to see that some obligations are fulfilled, and hopefully we can do it legally. But we're going to go in and talk to the workers.
You're not doing it legally now.
My friend, this is just as legal as you taking jobs out of this country. Just as legal.
Doug, we're coming through.
Caterpillar was an example, a pure, raw example of how the absolute free market system left to its own devices destroys people.
This next man has been jailed. He's been detained. He's trying to fight for basic trade union rights in one of the most right-wing military dictatorships in the world, in Indonesia. A warm welcome to Brother Pukpahan. And the brother who's desperately trying to keep peace alive in the difficult area in the Middle East. I saw his picture in the Globe and Mail a couple of weeks ago at a meeting with Yasser Arafat, the General Secretary of the Palestinian General Federation of Trade Unions, Brother Shahid. If the people of South Africa are willing to die for the cause, the least we can do is help them financially and morally in speaking out against the injustice, and we will continue to do that.
When he became president of the Canadian Labour Congress, one of the first international trips he wanted to make was to South Africa. It's hard to explain the type of meeting that those two men had. They recognized each other as soulmates, and as a result of that, there was a mutual respect, a mutually respectful discussion that took place. It was an amazing moment in history. We met with local union leadership. He understood those and cared about them, and liked nothing better than to have a beer and to talk to those leaders about those kind of issues.
And the facts are this center would not have been here if it had been the current director's decision way back in those days. It was a group, as Dennis and I talked last night, of rank-and-file activists, and they wanted to have a place of their own in Canada. But the importance of this center is what happens here. There's no greater importance for activists than knowledge and information. It's about building internal solidarity. It's about getting in classes and talking directly with each other about sexism at the workplace in our society, about racism, about homophobia, about all of the things that divide us, about equality issues, about economic and social justice. And what's important about a center like this, I think, is it doesn't matter from what part of the country you come from what section you work in, you find as you sit around afterwards, you hear the debates, you have much, much more in common than you have differences. Tomorrow, in all of the major daily newspapers across the country, I think 42 in total, we are taking full two-page ads to make the case, we believe, against free trade and for an election on behalf of the Canadian people.
That our jobs are not up for sale, our social programs are not up for sale, our cultural identity is not up for sale, our political independence is not up for sale. Canada does not belong to the government of Ottawa. It belongs to the people of this country, and we're going to damn well have something to say about what happens to it in the future.
Speaking against the free trade agreement, Maud Barlow and Bob White.
I've seen corporate America up close. I've seen their value systems. I've had to lead fights to stop them from bringing those value systems to apply to Canadian workers. And I don't want those value systems to become the yardstick of the relationship between our two countries.
The CAW continued the union's tradition of taking a stand on social issues. The union participated in protests against cruise missile testing in Canada, for example.
If the cruise missile was canceled, obviously it would have some effect on some employment in both Canada and the United States. But surely in this world that we live in, we ought to be able to find some peaceful production that would replace that.
The union also continued to support the causes of many workers in other unions. It marched alongside farm workers. It participated in events in support of workers at Eaton's.
Le mot respect est toujours celui qui me vient en idée. Respect des autres, respect de ses membres, respect.
He understood completely that you want to rise with your class and not from your class.
The question of the world is not do we have enough wealth. We have more wealth in the world than we have ever seen. The question is how we're going to share it.
Bob was democratically, altruistically charismatic.